The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber stretched upward into darkness, each panel carved from crystallized starlight that hummed with ancient power. Ambassador David Reed stood before them, his simple black suit a stark contrast to the impossible architecture surrounding him. The doors were easily 50 meters tall, and as they began to open with a sound like distant thunder, David felt the weight of 10,000 years of galactic civilization pressing down upon him. Beyond the threshold lay a chamber so vast that Earth's largest stadiums would seem like closets in comparison. Floating platforms arranged in perfect spirals rose toward a domed ceiling that displayed the real-time positions of every star system under Council authority. On each platform sat representatives from species that had conquered worlds while humanity was still learning to make fire. David stepped forward onto a narrow bridge that extended toward the center of the chamber. Below him, an abyss of swirling energy showed the birth and death of stars in accelerated time. Above him, hundreds of alien eyes tracked his movement with predatory interest. The bridge carried him to a circular platform in the chamber's heart, where he found himself surrounded by creatures from his worst nightmares and wildest dreams. To his left, a being of pure crystallized thought pulsed with mathematical equations that hurt to look at directly. To his right, something that resembled a cross between a giant spider and a space station clicked mechanical limbs in rhythmic patterns. At the chamber's highest point sat High Chancellor Veltar, her serpentine form coiled around a throne of living metal. Her scales shifted color with her emotions, currently displaying deep purple patterns that David's briefing materials had identified as extreme displeasure, human representative. Her voice echoed through neural implants that had been surgically installed in David's brain just hours before. You stand before the Galactic Council charged with representing a species that has violated the most fundamental laws of civilized space. David remained motionless, his hands clasped behind his back. In his earpiece, a small device pulsed with soft static, a sound only he could hear. Earth designation Terra 3 Solar System 7 Alpha has been observed conducting activities beyond the scope of its assigned development level, continued the Chancellor. Your species has been classified as pre-contact, non-spacefaring, limited technology. Yet our monitoring stations have detected energy signatures that suggest otherwise. A holographic display materialized above David's head, showing Earth in perfect detail. Red markers began appearing across the planet's surface, indicating what the Council believed were primitive settlements and basic industrial centers. Our scouts report nuclear technology in its infancy, chemical-based propulsion systems, and basic digital communication networks, announced General Crix, his insectoid form rising from a platform to David's right. Standard Class 2 civilization parameters. Nothing that should produce the readings we have been detecting. David finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber despite its impossible acoustics. Honorable Council members, before we proceed, may I ask a question about your monitoring procedures? The chamber fell silent. Several alien representatives exchanged glances through whatever sensory organs they possessed. It was unheard of for a defendant to request information from the Council. Chancellor Veltar's scales shifted to a lighter purple, indicating curiosity mixed with irritation. You may ask, how long have your scouts been observing Earth? Standard pre-contact surveillance protocol requires 12 rotations of detailed observation before evaluation. General Crix responded automatically. 12 rotations, David repeated thoughtfully. And during this time, your observers remained completely undetected by our primitive technology. Obviously, scoffed Advisor Nex, her crystalline form refracting light in patterns of condescension. Our stealth capabilities are far beyond anything a Class 2 civilization could comprehend, let alone detect. David nodded slowly. That makes perfect sense. Your technology is clearly superior to anything we possess. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled aliens. So perhaps you can explain why we knew you were watching us from the very first day. The statement hit the chamber like a physical shockwave. Bio-neural networks blazed with sudden activity, as every species present began accessing their surveillance databases simultaneously. The chamber's ambient lighting flickered as processing power was diverted to analyze 12 rotations worth of reconnaissance data. Impossible, General Crix hissed, his mandibles clicking rapidly. Our stealth matrices operate on quantum-folded principles. No primitive species possesses the theoretical framework to even comprehend such technology, let alone detect it. You're absolutely right, David agreed pleasantly. It should be impossible. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small, smooth device about the size of a human fist. As he held it up, the device began emitting a soft blue light that seemed to resonate with the chamber's crystalline architecture. This device contains complete technical specifications for every scout ship that entered our solar system, David announced calmly. Crew manifests, mission parameters, stealth matrix configurations, and communication protocols. We've been cataloging your activities with the same thoroughness that you've been cataloging ours. The chamber erupted in controlled chaos. Representative platforms began moving in complex patterns as alien species consulted with their homeworlds through faster-than-light communication networks. Data streams flowed like rivers of light across the chamber's displays as every council member tried to verify the impossible claim. Chancellor Veltar's scales had shifted to deep red, a color David's briefing materials indicated extreme alarm. You are claiming that a primitive species not only detected our most advanced reconnaissance craft, but also successfully analyzed their technical specifications? Not just analyzed, David corrected gently. Reverse engineered. The device in his hand pulsed once, and suddenly every screen in the chamber displayed information that should not have existed. Detailed schematics of council technology, quantum stealth principles broken down into mathematical formulas, communication encryption keys that were supposed to be unbreakable. For 12 rotations you observed us, David continued, his voice now carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. You cataloged our cities, our military capabilities, our technological development. What you didn't realize is that we were doing exactly the same thing to you. Advisor Nex's crystalline form began pulsing with erratic light patterns. This data is classified beyond any clearance level. Even if you somehow detected our presence, accessing this information would require technological capabilities far exceeding anything we observed on your planet. That's correct, David said with a smile that somehow managed to be both polite and terrifying. Which means your observations were incomplete. The implications of his words settled over the chamber like a poisonous cloud. If humanity had been capable of detecting and analyzing council technology from the beginning, then everything they thought they knew about Earth was wrong. General Crix found his voice first. If your species possesses such capabilities, why did you allow our surveillance to continue? Why not reveal yourselves immediately? David's smile widened slightly. Because we needed to learn about you before we decided what to do about you. He gestured toward the vast chamber around them. This council has existed for 10,000 years. You've contacted thousands of species, integrated them into your civilization through diplomacy or force. We wanted to understand your methods before we determined our response. The device in his hand pulsed again, and new data began flowing across the chamber's displays. Historical records of first contact scenarios, subjugation protocols, resource allocation agreements, integration procedures for unwilling species. We've been watching you for much longer than 12 rotations, David said quietly. We've seen how you deal with emerging civilizations. The patterns are quite predictable. Chancellor Veltar's voice became a whisper that somehow carried throughout the entire chamber. How long have you been watching us? David looked directly into her alien eyes, and for a moment the mask of diplomatic politeness slipped away entirely. Long enough to know that this conversation was inevitable, he said. The only question was whether we would be having it as equals or as your newest subjects. The chamber fell into absolute silence as the full weight of humanity's deception became clear. They weren't dealing with a primitive species that had stumbled into advanced technology. They were facing a civilization that had been preparing for this moment for longer than anyone had imagined. And judging by the confidence in David's voice, humanity had been preparing for more than just talking. The silence in the Galactic Council chamber stretched like a living thing, broken only by the soft hum of bio-neural networks processing impossible data. Chancellor Veltar's scales had shifted through several color patterns before settling on a deep amber that David's briefing, materials identified as profound uncertainty. You speak of preparation, she said finally, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was communicating simultaneously with dozens of homeworlds. Yet our analysis indicates that your species lacks even basic void-walking capabilities. Your fastest vessels require chemical propulsion to escape your planet's gravity well. David nodded thoughtfully. Your analysis is based on what our observers allowed your scouts to see. Tell me, Chancellor, when your reconnaissance teams cataloged our space-based assets, did they focus primarily on government installations and military facilities? Standard protocol, General Crix responded automatically. Governmental structures provide the most accurate assessment of technological capability and military potential. Of course they do, David agreed. Very logical, very thorough. He paused, letting the device in his hand pulse once more. Unfortunately, you were looking in the wrong places. New holographic displays materialized around the chamber, but these showed a completely different Earth than the one in the Council's databases. Instead of primitive cities and basic industrial centers, the images revealed vast underground complexes that stretched for kilometers beneath major population centers. Orbital platforms that existed in folded space, invisible to conventional detection. Manufacturing facilities that operated on principles the assembled aliens didn't recognize. Impossible, whispered Advisor Nex, her crystalline form refracting light in patterns of disbelief. Our quantum sensors would have detected structures of this magnitude. The energy signatures alone would be impossible to mask. Not mask, David corrected gently. Redirect. The chamber's displays shifted again, showing technical specifications that made even the most advanced council representatives lean forward with interest. Energy systems that drew power directly from dimensional barriers. Manufacturing processes that assembled matter at the quantum level. Transportation networks that operated through carefully controlled spatial distortions. For 12 rotations, your scouts observed what we wanted them to observe, David continued, his voice carrying easily through the vast space. Surface installations using technology we developed specifically to appear primitive. Chemical rockets that we built to match your expectations of our capabilities. Communication networks that we deliberately limited to suggest a Class II civilization. General Crix's mandibles clicked rapidly as he processed the implications. You are suggesting that your entire visible civilization is an elaborate deception? Not a deception, David said carefully. A precaution. He began walking slowly around the circular platform, his movements deliberate and controlled. Several alien representatives tracked his motion with what passed for their sensory organs, clearly uncomfortable with his calm confidence in their presence. You see, members of the Council, humanity has a unique perspective on galactic civilization. We've been monitoring your activities for much longer than you realize. We've observed how you handle first contact with emerging species. The patterns are quite clear. The device in his hand projected new data into the air around them. Historical records showing the fate of hundreds of species that had encountered the Galactic Council over the past 10 millennia. Some had been integrated peacefully. Others had been conquered after refusing cooperation. A few had simply disappeared from all records. Initial contact followed by evaluation, followed by integration or elimination, David summarized. Very efficient. Very predictable. He stopped walking and faced Chancellor Veltar directly. We decided we preferred a different outcome. The Chancellor's scales shifted to deep red as the full implications of his words became clear. You are threatening the Galactic Council? Not threatening, David replied with that same unsettling calm. Presenting options. The chamber's bioluminescent walls suddenly pulsed in a pattern that every alien present recognized as an emergency alert. Communication channels blazed with activity as messages flooded in from across the galaxy. General Crix's bio-neural interface erupted with incoming data streams that made his compound eyes widen in alarm. Multiple energy signatures detected in restricted space, he announced, his voice tight with controlled panic. Unknown vessel configurations appearing throughout Council-controlled systems. Fleet Command is reporting simultaneous contact with unidentified craft in 17 sectors. David smiled pleasantly. Right on schedule. The chamber's main display shifted to show a real-time galactic map that painted a picture no council member had ever seen before. Across hundreds of star systems, new contacts were appearing on defense networks that were supposed to be impenetrable. Ships that didn't match any known configuration were materializing in spaces that should have been empty. How is this possible? Chancellor Veltar's voice carried harmonics of fear that resonated through the neural networks connecting every representative in the chamber. Our detection grids monitor every cubic meter of council space. Nothing can approach our systems without triggering automated responses. Nothing using known technology, David agreed. But then your detection systems are designed to identify threats you understand. Energy signatures you recognize. Propulsion methods you've encountered before. He gestured toward the displays showing impossible ship configurations. We've been careful to avoid those limitations. Advisor Nex's crystalline form was now pulsing with erratic patterns that suggested complete system overload. The computational power required to coordinate simultaneous appearances across multiple sectors would exceed the processing capabilities of any known civilization. Even the Council's central networks would struggle with such complexity. The Council's networks, David repeated thoughtfully. Centralized command structures. Hierarchical communication protocols. Very organized. Very vulnerable to disruption. He paused, letting the implications sink in. We've had 12 rotations to study your systems, remember? As if summoned by his words, new alarms began sounding throughout the chamber. The bio-neural networks that connected the Council's vast civilization started experiencing mysterious delays. Communication channels flickered with interference that defied analysis. Data streams that had operated flawlessly for millennia began showing systematic errors. You're attacking our infrastructure, General Crix accused, his form rising to its full intimidating height. We're demonstrating capabilities, David corrected calmly. There's a significant difference between an attack and a presentation. The distinction was lost on most of the assembled aliens, as reports continued flooding in from across their territory. Defense platforms going offline. Communication hubs experiencing unexplained failures. Fleet formations losing coordination as their command networks suffered cascading disruptions. What do you want? Chancellor Veltar demanded, her serpentine form coiled tight with tension. David reached into his other pocket and withdrew a second device, identical to the first but pulsing with a different frequency. What we've always wanted, Chancellor. To be left alone. Your council has spent 10,000 years expanding across the galaxy, integrating species into your civilization whether they wanted to join or not, he continued, his voice taking on an edge that made even the largest alien representative step back. You've created a vast empire, built on the assumption that superior technology gives you the right to make decisions for lesser species. The second device began projecting data that showed the true scope of the Council's expansion. Conquered worlds, subjugated populations, resources stripped from unwilling civilizations, species that had been forcibly integrated into the galactic community. We represent a species that refuses to accept that assumption, David said quietly. We've spent considerable time and effort ensuring that we have the capability to enforce our refusal. The chamber fell silent except for the increasingly frantic pulse of emergency, signals flooding in from across council space. Every alien representative was now fully focused on the humans standing calmly in their midst, a species they had dismissed as primitive, revealing capabilities that exceeded their understanding. You cannot fight the entire Galactic Council, General Crix stated, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Our combined fleets number in the hundreds of thousands. Our technology has been refined over millennia. Even if you possess some advanced capabilities, you cannot stand against such overwhelming force. David looked up at the massive insectoid form with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than any human should possess. General, you're making the same mistake your scouts made when they observed Earth. You're assuming you understand what you're looking at. The two devices in his hands pulsed simultaneously, and the chamber's displays showed something that made every alien present feel a chill run through whatever passed for their circulatory systems. It was a fleet. But not just any fleet. Ships that dwarfed anything in the Council's databases, hung in perfect formation around Earth, their hulls reflecting light in patterns that suggested they existed partially outside. The revelation hit the Galactic Council chamber like a supernova. Bio-neural networks blazed with desperate activity, as every species simultaneously accessed their deepest historical archives, searching for any reference to human expansion beyond Earth. The chamber's crystalline walls pulsed with emergency frequencies that painted the vast space in strobing patterns of red and gold. Chancellor Veltar's serpentine form uncoiled from her throne for the first time in living memory, her massive bulk rising to tower over the assembly. Her scales had shifted to a color David's briefing materials didn't recognize, something beyond the normal spectrum of her species' emotional displays. Multiple worlds, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was simultaneously consulting with the Council's highest strategic authorities. You are claiming that humanity has established colonies beyond Earth without our detection? David tilted his head slightly as if considering the question. Not colonies, Chancellor. That implies Earth is our primary world. He paused, letting the two devices in his hands pulse in synchronized patterns. What if I told you that Earth isn't our homeworld at all? The statement triggered immediate chaos in the chamber. Advisor Nex's crystalline form began cycling through light patterns so rapidly that several nearby representatives shielded their sensory organs. General Crix's mandibles clicked in staccato bursts as he processed implications that threatened to overturn everything the Council believed about galactic civilization. Impossible, the General hissed. Our deep space monitoring networks track every inhabited system within 1,000 light-years of Council space. No advanced civilization could develop without our knowledge. Every inhabited system that uses technology you recognize, David corrected gently. Energy signatures you can detect. Communication methods you understand. Propulsion systems that follow principles you've encountered before. He gestured toward the displays still showing impossible human ships. We've been very careful to avoid those limitations. The chamber's main display shifted to show a three-dimensional map of local galactic space, with every known Council world marked in blue. As they watched, new markers began appearing in red, scattered throughout regions the Council had classified as empty space or primitive systems, unsuitable for colonization. 17 systems, David announced calmly, some in regions you consider too dangerous for settlement. Others in areas you dismissed as resource poor. A few in spaces you've never bothered to explore because they contain nothing you consider valuable. The red markers multiplied as more data flowed into the display. 30 systems, 50, 75, each one showing energy signatures and infrastructure that matched the impossible technology they were seeing around Earth. This cannot be accurate, Chancellor Veltar whispered, but her voice carried less conviction with each new marker that appeared. The coordination required to establish settlements across such distances, the resources needed to support populations without detectable supply lines, would be impossible using methods you understand, David agreed. Transportation networks that require decades to traverse interstellar distances, supply chains that depend on conventional faster-than-light communication, colonial expansion that follows predictable patterns based on resource availability. The displays around them shifted again, showing technical specifications that made even the Council's most advanced theorists lean forward with desperate interest. Transportation systems that operated through carefully controlled dimensional apertures, communication networks that transmitted information through quantum entanglement matrices, manufacturing processes that converted matter directly from quantum foam. We've been developing these technologies for much longer than you realize, David continued, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber despite the frantic activity around him. While you've been expanding across the galaxy using conventional methods, we've been exploring alternatives. Different approaches. Solutions that don't depend on the principles you consider fundamental. General Crix's bio-neural interface erupted with new data streams as reports continued flooding in from across Council space. Fleet Command is confirming contact with human vessels in systems we believed uninhabited, he announced, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Technologies that don't match any known configuration. Energy signatures that our sensors can barely detect. Because your sensors are designed to identify threats you understand, David said patiently. We've spent considerable effort ensuring that our activities remain invisible to conventional detection methods. The two devices in his hands pulsed again, and suddenly the chamber's display showed real-time feeds from across the galaxy. Human ships moving through space using principles that seemed to bend reality around them. Orbital installations that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Planetary settlements that had been thriving for centuries in systems the Council had never bothered to investigate. How long? Chancellor Veltar's voice was barely audible above the emergency signals flooding through the bio-neural networks. How long have you been expanding without our knowledge? David smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Long enough to be well established when this moment arrived. The implications of his words settled over the chamber like a toxic cloud. If humanity had been secretly expanding for centuries or millennia, then their technological capabilities were far beyond anything the Council had imagined. More importantly, their strategic position was completely unknown. "You've been watching us," Advisor Nex said, her crystalline form pulsing with erratic patterns that suggested system overload, "learning our methods, studying our weaknesses, planning for eventual contact." "Planning for eventual confrontation," David corrected quietly. "We've observed how the Council deals with species that refuse integration. The historical precedents are quite clear." New data began flowing across the displays, showing detailed analyses of Council military doctrine, strategic thinking, and response patterns. Battle plans that had been classified for millennia. Tactical weaknesses that no external observer should have been able to identify. Strategic assets whose locations were known only to the highest levels of Council leadership. "This intelligence is impossible to obtain," General Crix stated, but his voice carried no conviction. "Our security protocols prevent any external access to strategic databases." "Your security protocols assume that potential threats will use methods you understand," David replied. "Conventional espionage, traditional infiltration techniques, information gathering that follows patterns you can recognize and counter." He gestured toward the displays showing impossible ships and installations. "We've been using the same alternative approaches to intelligence gathering that we've used for everything else." The chamber fell silent except for the increasingly frantic pulse of emergency communications. Every alien representative was now fully focused on the humans standing calmly in their midst, a species they had dismissed as primitive, revealing capabilities that exceeded their worst fears. "What do you want?" Chancellor Veltar demanded, her massive form coiled with tension. "If you possess such overwhelming advantages, why reveal yourselves now? Why not simply eliminate the Council if we pose a threat to your expansion?" David looked directly into her alien eyes, and for a moment, the diplomatic mask slipped away entirely. "Because we're not like you, Chancellor. We don't believe that superior technology gives us the right to make decisions for other species. But," he continued, his voice taking on an edge that made every alien in the chamber step back, "we also won't allow other species to make decisions for us." The devices in his hands pulsed one final time, and the chamber's displays showed something that made every Council member feel their worst fears, crystallizing into reality. It was a tactical assessment of their own military capabilities, analyzed from a human perspective and found wanting. Fleet positions that could be disrupted by targeted dimensional distortions. Communication networks that could be severed by quantum interference. Industrial centers that were vulnerable to attack methods the Council had never considered defending against. "You could destroy us," General Crix whispered, his compound eyes reflecting the displays showing the Council's strategic weaknesses. "We could," David agreed simply, "but that would make us no better than you." He pocketed both devices and straightened, his diplomatic uniform with movements so casual. They seemed almost insulting in the face of such impossible revelations. "Instead, we're offering you a choice," he said. "The same choice you've offered to hundreds of species over the past 10 millennia. The chamber held its breath as David smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since entering the vast space. "Submit to our terms, or face the consequences of refusal." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Galactic Council found itself on the receiving end of an ultimatum. And judging by everything they had just learned about humanity's true capabilities, it was an ultimatum they could not refuse. The only question was whether they would accept it with dignity or force humanity to demonstrate just how serious they were about enforcement, based on the confidence in David's voice. The human delegation was prepared for either response. The silence in the Galactic Council chamber stretched beyond uncomfortable into something approaching terror. Chancellor Veltar's scales had shifted to a color that didn't exist in any diplomatic database, while bio-neural networks throughout the vast space flickered with overloaded processing cycles as every species tried to comprehend the impossible situation they faced. "Terms," the Chancellor finally whispered, her voice carrying harmonics of defeat that resonated through the neural implants of every representative present. "You speak of terms as if we are defeated enemies rather than the governing authority of galactic civilization." David nodded thoughtfully. "That's an interesting perspective, Chancellor. Tell me, When you offer terms to species you encounter during expansion, do you consider them equals in the negotiation? The question hit the chamber like a physical blow. Around the circular platform, alien representatives who had spent millennia on the giving end of such ultimatums now found themselves experiencing the receiving end for the first time. The role reversal was as psychologically devastating as it was politically impossible. The Council operates through consensus, Advisor Nex stated, her crystalline form pulsing with defensive patterns. We seek integration and cooperation, not domination. With superior military force standing ready to ensure cooperation, David added pleasantly. Very efficient, very practical. He gestured toward the displays still showing the Council's strategic weaknesses. We've simply adopted similar methods. General Crix's mandibles clicked in rapid patterns as he consulted with military authorities across the galaxy through his bio-neural interface. Our strategic analysts require clarification of your capabilities before any decisions can be made. The claims you present exceed theoretical possibilities. Of course they do, David agreed. Your theories are based on principles we abandoned centuries ago. He smiled with what might have been sympathy. Would you like a demonstration? Before anyone could respond, David reached into his jacket and withdrew a third device, smaller than the others but pulsing with an intensity that made the chamber's crystalline walls resonate in harmonic frequencies. As he activated it, every screen in the vast space went dark for exactly 3 seconds. When the displays returned, they showed something that made every alien present feel their species' equivalent of blood freezing in their veins. It was the Council's primary fleet, the 7th Battle Group that had been mobilized as a precautionary measure when human activities were first detected. 1,200 vessels representing the finest military technology in the galaxy hung motionless in space like insects preserved in amber. Their weapons were dark, their shields were down, and they were completely surrounded by human ships that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime. This is real-time footage from your own fleet sensors, David announced calmly. No weapons have been fired. No aggressive actions have been taken. Your ships are simply unable to move or operate their systems. General Crix's compound eyes widened as data flowed through his neural interface. Impossible. The 7th Battle Group operates with completely independent systems. Quantum encrypted networks, isolated command structures. No external force could simultaneously disable such diverse technologies. No external force using methods you understand, David corrected. But then, we've established that your understanding has certain limitations. The display shifted to show technical readouts from the disabled fleet. Every ship showing identical system failures that defied analysis. Propulsion systems that simply wouldn't respond to commands. Weapons arrays that had somehow forgotten how to operate. Communication networks that carried signals perfectly but couldn't transmit orders. The effect is completely reversible, David continued conversationally. No permanent damage has been done to your ships or crews. We're simply demonstrating that conventional military force is not a viable option in this situation. Chancellor, Feltar's serpentine form had begun trembling with what David's briefing materials identified as species-wide existential terror. How many fleets could you disable simultaneously? All of them, David replied simply. The 2 words fell into the chamber like antimatter bombs. Every alien representative began accessing emergency protocols simultaneously, creating a cascade of bio-neural activity that made the chamber's walls pulse with strobe-like intensity. You're claiming the ability to neutralize the entire Council military across hundreds of star systems. Advisor Nex's crystalline form was cycling through light patterns so rapidly they created stroboscopic effects. The computational power required would exceed the processing capacity of entire civilizations. Traditional computational power, David agreed. Linear processing systems, binary logic structures, information networks that operate according to principles you consider fundamental. He paused, letting the small device in his hand pulse once more. We've moved beyond those limitations. New displays materialized around the chamber, showing processing systems that seemed to operate outside normal space-time. Quantum computers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Information networks that transmitted data through manipulation of reality itself. For 10,000 years, the Council has represented the pinnacle of galactic technological achievement, David continued, his voice carrying easily through the vast space despite the frantic activity around him. You've established that position through superior force, applied consistently across lesser civilizations. We're here to inform you that your position has changed. The statement triggered immediate chaos as every species present began consulting with their homeworlds through faster-than-light communication networks. Emergency sessions were called in capital cities across the galaxy. Military commands were placed on highest alert. Strategic reserves were mobilized for conflicts that conventional wisdom said were impossible. Our terms are simple, David announced, raising his voice slightly to carry over the commotion. The Council will cease all expansion activities immediately. Existing member species may continue their current arrangements if they choose, but no new civilizations will be forced into integration. He gestured toward the displays showing disabled Council fleets. Military forces will be reduced to defensive levels only. No fleet larger than 50 vessels will be maintained in any single location. All strategic weapons platforms will be decommissioned under human supervision. Impossible, General Crick snarled, his insectoid form rising to its full intimidating height. You cannot dismantle 10 millennia of galactic civilization with impossible demands. We're not dismantling anything, David corrected patiently. We're offering the Council the same choice you've offered every species you've encountered. Accept new management or face the consequences of refusal. The chamber fell silent as the full implications became clear. For the first time in their history, the Galactic Council was being forced to choose between submission and destruction by a species they had considered primitive just hours before. And if we refuse? Chancellor Veltar asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. David smiled with genuine warmth. Then we'll demonstrate that superior technology really does give one species the right to make decisions for lesser civilizations. Your own precedent, Chancellor. We're simply following the example you've set. The small device in his hand pulsed again, and the chamber's display showed something that removed any doubt about humanity's willingness to follow through on their threats. It was a tactical simulation showing what would happen if human forces engaged the Council's military across all fronts simultaneously. The simulation lasted exactly 47 seconds. When it ended, no Council forces remained operational. Of course, David continued conversationally, we'd prefer to avoid such unpleasantness. We're not expansionist by nature. We don't seek to rule the galaxy or force our values on other species. He paused, meeting the terrified gazes of every alien representative in the chamber. We simply want to be left alone to develop our civilization without interference from species who believe their technological superiority gives them the right to make our choices for us, General. Crix's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely. And if we agree to your terms, what guarantee do we have that humanity won't expand its influence once we've weakened our defenses? David considered the question seriously. The same guarantee you've given to every species you've integrated, General. Our word that we'll honor the agreement as long as you do. The parallel was too obvious to miss. For 10,000 years, the Council had relied on superior force to ensure compliance with their agreements. Now they were being offered the same arrangement from the opposite position. You have exactly 72 standard hours to provide your answer, David announced, checking a simple wristwatch that seemed almost insultingly mundane in the face of such impossible demonstrations. After that time, we'll assume you've chosen to refuse our terms. And then? Chancellor Veltar whispered. David's smile never wavered. Then we'll begin implementing our own expansion policies, starting with the systems that pose the greatest threat to human interests. 71 hours and 43 minutes after David Reed had delivered humanity's ultimatum, the Galactic Council chamber filled once again with representatives from across known space. But this time the atmosphere was fundamentally different. The bio-neural networks that had buzzed with confident authority now pulsed with the subdued rhythms of defeat. The crystalline walls that had reflected the light of galactic dominance now seemed dim and fragile. Chancellor Veltar's scales had settled into a pattern of deep blue that David's updated briefing materials identified as formal submission. Her serpentine form remained coiled around the throne, but her posture suggested a creature that had aged centuries in less than 3 days. Ambassador Reed, she began, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the neural implants with unmistakable finality. The Galactic Council has reached a consensus regarding your terms. David stood on the same circular platform where he had revealed humanity's true nature, his hands clasped behind his back in the same diplomatic posture. But now every alien in the chamber understood that the simple human before them represented a force that could reshape galactic civilization at will. "We are prepared to accept your conditions," the Chancellor continued, each word clearly causing her physical pain to speak. "Military forces will be reduced to defensive configurations. Expansion activities will cease immediately. No civilization will be forced into Council membership against their will." A murmur rippled through the assembled representatives, species that had built their power on Council expansion, now facing an uncertain future. General Crix's mandibles clicked once in what David recognized as acknowledgement of military defeat. "However," Chancellor Veltar added, her scale shifting to include traces of amber, "we require clarification on several points before formal ratification." David nodded slightly. "Of course. Transition periods for arrangements of this magnitude require careful coordination. First," the Chancellor said, "existing member species. Many civilizations have been integrated into Council society for millennia. Their economies, their cultures, their very identities are intertwined with galactic institutions. Sudden abandonment would cause massive suffering. We have no interest in causing unnecessary hardship," David replied. "Species that choose to maintain their Council relationships may do so freely. Our concern is with forced integration, not voluntary cooperation." Advisor Nex's crystalline form pulsed with patterns David had learned to recognize as cautious relief. Second point, trade relationships. The galactic economy depends on resources and technologies shared across thousands of worlds. Complete isolation would cause civilizational collapse. Trade agreements negotiated between willing partners pose no threat to anyone, David said pleasantly. Commerce based on mutual benefit rather than coercion serves everyone's interests. Third point, General Crix interjected, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Security concerns. The galaxy contains hostile forces beyond Council space. Pirates, rogue civilizations, species that reject all diplomatic contact. Without coordinated defense, many worlds will be vulnerable to aggression." David's expression became more serious. Defensive cooperation against genuine threats is not the same as forced integration under threat of conquest. "We're not opposed to mutual defense agreements between sovereign species." And finally, Chancellor Veltar said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "Enforcement. How do we know that humanity will honor these agreements? What prevents your species from expanding your influence once we've reduced our military capabilities?" The question that had haunted the Council for 72 hours hung in the air like poison. David reached into his jacket and withdrew the same small device that had demonstrated humanity's overwhelming technological superiority. As he held it up, every alien in the chamber tensed reflexively. "The same thing that has prevented us from expanding our influence for the past several millennia," David said quietly. "We don't want your worlds, Chancellor. We don't want to rule your species. We don't want to impose our values on civilizations that prefer different approaches." He activated the device, and the chamber's displays showed something that no alien had expected to see. It was a detailed map of human space, but instead of the aggressive expansion patterns the Council had feared, it showed something entirely different. Defensive installations surrounding human worlds. Peaceful research stations in uninhabited systems. Exploration vessels that carefully avoided contact with other civilizations. A pattern of development that focused inward rather than outward. For over 3,000 years, humanity has possessed the technology to conquer this galaxy, David announced, his words causing several alien representatives to step backward in shock. "We chose not to." "Impossible," General Crix whispered. "No species develop such capabilities without using them for expansion. The drive for growth and resources is fundamental to all civilizations." "To your civilizations," David corrected gently. "Humanity chose a different path." New displays materialized around the chamber, showing human colonies that had existed for millennia in careful isolation. Worlds that had been terraformed without displacing existing ecosystems. Research facilities that studied the universe without exploiting its resources. A civilization that had grown powerful through internal development rather than external conquest. "We watched you," David continued, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence. "We learned from your mistakes. We saw what happened to species that chose expansion over sustainability, conquest over cooperation, dominance over development. The displays shifted to show historical analyses of galactic civilizations that had risen and fallen over the millennia, species that had conquered vast territories only to collapse under the weight of their own expansion, empires that had exhausted their resources through endless growth, civilizations that had destroyed themselves through the very ambitions that had made them powerful. "We decided we preferred a different approach," David said simply. "Internal growth, sustainable development, peaceful coexistence with neighbors who shared similar values." Chancellor Veltar's scales had shifted to a pattern David had never seen before, something that seemed to combine confusion with the emotion his briefing materials couldn't identify. "But if you possessed such overwhelming advantages, why reveal yourselves now? Why not continue in isolation?" David's expression became genuinely sad for the first time since entering the chamber. "Because isolation is no longer an option. Your expansion has reached the borders of human space. First contact was inevitable. We had a choice," he continued, his voice taking on an edge that reminded every alien present of their precarious situation. "We could allow you to discover us on your terms when you felt ready to integrate us into your civilization. Or we could reveal ourselves on our terms when we were ready to deal with you as equals." The implications settled over the chamber like a heavy blanket. The Council had been approaching humanity for forced integration, completely unaware that they were walking into a trap that had been 3 millennia in the making. "The agreement stands as presented," David announced, checking his wristwatch one final time. "The Council will withdraw to defensive postures. Expansion activities will cease. No civilization will be forced into membership against their will." He pocketed the device and straightened, his diplomatic uniform with the same casual movements that had seemed so insignificant at the beginning of their encounter. "In return, humanity will continue our policy of non-interference with species that prefer Council membership. We have no territorial ambitions beyond our current borders. We seek no tribute, no resources, no acknowledgement of superiority. We simply want to be left alone." Chancellor Veltar's massive form uncoiled from her throne one final time, her scales settling into a pattern that David's materials identified as formal agreement. "The Galactic Council accepts these terms. May this agreement serve the interests of all civilizations." David smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since the negotiations began. "May it indeed, Chancellor." As he turned to leave the chamber, walking across the same bridge that had carried him into the heart of galactic power, David allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Behind him, alien representatives began the process of dismantling 10 millennia of expansion-based civilization. Ahead of him lay a galaxy where species could develop according to their own values, free from the threat of forced integration or conquest. It wasn't perfect, but it was a significant improvement over the alternative. And in the depths of space, human ships began powering down the weapon systems they had hoped never to use, returning to the peaceful exploration and development that had always been their preference. The galaxy had learned an important lesson about the dangers of assuming that technological primitiveness indicated weakness. Humanity had learned an equally important lesson about the necessity of being prepared to enforce one's desire for peace. Both lessons, David reflected as he departed the council chamber for the final time, were likely to serve everyone well in the centuries to come. The age of forced galactic expansion was over. The age of voluntary cooperation was about to begin.